Hunters, what's the creepiest thing you've encountered in the woods? I have a wild story about my time out in the backcountry. I was elk hunting with my dad. While we were glassing over a deep canyon, we spotted a bear moving down at the bottom. It never gave me a clean window for a shot, but it was easily the biggest black bear I have ever seen in my life. It was not quite as massive as a fully grown grizzly, but it was definitely large enough to do some serious damage to yours truly. The animal ambled along the canyon floor for a while. It perfectly kept a tree or a boulder between my lens and the shot I needed, until it finally drifted out of sight. We were tempted to go after it, but we decided to stay focused on our main goal and kept looking for elk. Several hours later, we spotted a decent bull on the opposite side of the ridge, and I took the shot. We started heading down our side of the canyon, only to realize the terrain was way steeper than we had anticipated. At one point, my dad damn near slid right down onto a pair of rattlesnakes. It took us about 10 minutes of sliding and climbing just to hit the bottom, then a few minutes to cross the floor, and another 20 minutes to claw our way up to the elk. By the time we finished dressing the animal, we realized it was getting incredibly late. The sun was dipping below the horizon just as we began packing the heavy loads back toward our camp. We hit the pitch-black floor of the canyon and started walking across. Suddenly, we heard something massive moving through the thick brush just a short distance away. That was the exact moment the severity of our predicament hit us. We were completely stranded in the dark, right in the middle of a large predator's territory, carrying almost 100 pounds of raw, fresh meat, and that animal was getting dangerously close to our position. Needless to say, we were scared shitless. We started scrambling up the opposite side of the canyon as fast as possible. It was brutal because the incline was incredibly steep, and we completely lost the trail we had used to come down. We had to push our way up through thick brush that was taller than both of us. It took us almost an hour of pure agony to reach the top. The entire time we kept hearing that heavy presence in the bushes, matching our pace. At certain points we could clearly hear some deep, heavy breathing echoing in the dark. We finally hit the crest and started walking at a frantic pace toward our camp, completely exhausted. Whatever was behind us kept tracking our footsteps, but we could not see a damn thing in the shadows. The moment we stumbled into our campsite, my dad scrambled to turn on a super bright LED lantern we had left on the table. The beam sliced through the darkness. Less than 50 yards away, that massive black bear was standing perfectly still, staring right at us. The clever bastard had tracked our scent all the way back to our tents. He was not acting aggressive, just intensely curious about the meat. I did not have a bear tag for the season, so discharging my weapon was out of the question. We kept our eyes locked on him while we quickly tied the fresh meat high up in a tree. We stayed awake for another half hour, holding our breath until the silhouette finally melted back into the woods. At that point, the adrenaline faded and exhaustion took over. We crawled into our tent and crashed from sheer terror. The next morning, we checked the perimeter. There was no sign of him anywhere, except for the heavy tracks left around the edge of our camp. We packed up our gear and left the area immediately. Cultural note: big game hunters packing raw meat through deep valleys face a high risk of tracking incidents, as the acute olfactory senses of black bears can detect fresh blood from miles away. Wildlife safety protocols dictate elevating harvest yields at least 12 feet high and 100 yards away from sleeping quarters, as curious predators will routinely shadow human movement to scavenge scraps without initiating an open confrontation. It was only my second time ever going out hunting. I was out in the wilderness with my dad and two of his closest buddies. We were down in southeast Alaska, stationed on a remote island. Our group had set up camp right in the middle of a medium-sized cove. The rugged shore was surrounded by a matching mountain range as you moved further inland. We had planned to stay out there for 4 days, hoping to bag some deer. On the first and second days, my dad and I climbed up a few hundred feet in several different spots. We had zero luck, finding nothing but meandering, thick old-growth timber. As evening rolled around on that second day, our group spotted a lone wolf emerging from the tree line across the water. The animal calmly lay down right on the shore. After a few moments, another, much larger wolf stepped out of the brush, accompanied by what we assumed to be his mate. They settled down next to the first one, which quickly moved a few yards away to give them space. Watching them through our optics, we figured that the largest wolf was definitely the alpha male of the pack. On the morning of the third day, the real reason why we couldn't find a single deer became incredibly obvious. The wolves were actively hunting the exact same area. Movies always imply that wolves just howl randomly into the night, or that you only ever hear a single dramatic echo, but that is not how it works at all. These predators were howling with a clear strategic purpose. They were doing it to panic the deer around the cove and then corner them against the natural barriers. The pack started their chorus at the right tip of the cove. Their dissonant tones echoed over miles of empty wilderness. Next thing I know, they began moving their way around the perimeter, heading straight toward our position. My dad and I decided to head up the slope once again, since we didn't want to just sit around. This time, when we were a few hundred feet up the incline, that chilling chorus started up again. But there was one specific howl much louder than the rest. It was dangerously close. We stopped dead in our tracks right below a massive, fallen tree trunk to listen. The sound was closing the gap fast. I had been carrying our primary rifle, a 6.5 Creedmoor bolt action. My dad looked at me with a serious expression and told me to chamber around immediately. He pulled out his own handgun, a .40 Smith & Wesson, and racked the slide loudly. He was hoping the mechanical metallic crunch would be enough to scare the animal off. The howling kept drawing closer, originating from just up above us on the ridge. A few minutes passed in complete silence. I was staring intently up the steep slope of the mountain, squinting through the dense old growth, when I finally caught movement. With its nose pressed firmly to the frozen ground, that massive alpha wolf stepped into view. He was not even 30 yards away from us, intently tracking the fresh scent of some other animal. With their acute senses, he had to have known we were standing right there by scent, sound, and sight. But the giant predator chose to completely ignore our presence, staying locked on his prey. We held our breath until his silhouette vanished into the thickets. Needless to say, we did not find a single deer on that trip. Cultural note: the Alexander Archipelago wolf, native to southeast Alaska, relies on coastal old-growth forests, where complex pack dynamics allow them to efficiently herd Sitka black-tailed deer. When hunting in packs, their vocalizations serve as a tactical tool to drive prey into natural cul-de-sacs along shorelines, and their tolerance of human presence often increases when they are actively engaged in a high-priority tracking sequence. I started hunting back in 2020 because I was absolutely tired of being cooped up indoors. My wife's family owns 9 acres of land, which includes several acres of completely untouched woods. Because of that, they gave me the perfect opportunity to use their private tree stand. I went out there several times last year, but I only ever spotted 2 deer. I never even got a shot off. Mostly, it was just an incredible time to be out in nature and witness the quiet wilderness. I was out hunting one particular evening, and the woods were dead silent. There is a major highway located nearby, so you can usually hear a constant, distant drone of semi-trucks and cars passing by. But normally, the natural sounds of the woods take over after a while, and you start to feel extremely isolated in the brush. I was sitting still, listening as best I could for any signs of movement in the thickets. Suddenly, an insane volley of rapid gunshots exploded right behind me. The blasts were deafening and sounded like they were barely 10 feet behind my back. It surprised me so bad that my heart leaped into my throat, and I almost lost my balance and fell straight out of the elevated tree stand. I jumped up instantly, grabbed my bright orange safety hat, and started waving it around furiously in the air. I wanted to make sure that whoever was discharging a weapon so close to my position knew I was right there so they would cease fire. I scanned the dense tree line in a panic, but I did not see a single soul out there. The silence returned just as fast as the noise had started. I sat there frozen for another 15 minutes, trying to calm my shaking hands. I quickly gathered my gear and sprinted out of the woods as fast as my legs could carry me, holding that bright orange hat high above my head the entire time. When I finally made it back to my in-laws' house, they were also extremely confused by the noise and incredibly relieved to see I was okay. I still have absolutely no idea who fired that weapon or why, but in that exact moment, I honestly thought I was going to do something terrible out there and lose my life. Cultural note: Hunter orange, also known as blaze orange, is a highly visible color frequency that deer cannot easily perceive but is universally recognized by human hunters to prevent accidental discharge incidents in shared woods, in private acreage near major transport corridors, unauthorized target shooting or trespassing marks a severe safety breach, as dense foliage can easily mask a hunter's elevated position from individuals firing blindly from property borders. I was out moose hunting in the dense wilderness of northern Ontario. I had positioned myself right at the edge of a massive clearing that was heavily cluttered with downed trees and old stumps. I was leaning back against a large stump, quietly scanning the area. Suddenly, I heard the distinct sound of something heavy crashing through the trees closest to me. It was maybe 15 feet behind my back. I immediately turned around, expecting a huge moose to break through into the opening. I quickly stepped up onto a fallen tree trunk to give myself a little extra height to see clearly over the thick brush in the tree line. Instead of a moose, 9 massive timber wolves came sprinting out of the dark woods. They stopped dead in their tracks, about 6 feet away from where I was standing on that log. I already had my 7mm rifle shouldered and ready. The nearest wolves immediately crouched down low in the grass right in front of me, fixing their eyes on mine. The rest of the pack didn't just stand there. They quickly broke formation and began running around to get behind me, trying to encircle my position. I could feel every single hair on the back of my neck standing straight up. The adrenaline hit me like a physical wave. I knew I couldn't run. I just stood my ground firmly on that log. I was about 3 feet off the forest floor, and being 5 feet 11 inches tall, the extra elevation probably made me look at least a little intimidating to them. I slowly flicked the safety off my rifle. I dropped the barrel down, aiming directly at the nearest wolf just 6 feet away. My mind was racing. I kept thinking that if that alpha lunged at me, I would at least be ready to take it down. In that exact same instant, the entire pack suddenly bolted. They took off at full speed across the grassy opening. There was not a single growl, yip, or howl. The whole encounter was completely silent. Wolves can be incredibly dangerous when cornered, but 9 times out of 10, they are far more terrified of human beings and will choose to flee if given the chance. If I had not been armed with that specific wildlife knowledge, I might have panicked and pulled the trigger. Doing that would have easily triggered their natural defense mechanism to fight back as a pack. All in all, it was an incredibly exhilarating experience. I am always cautious when I step into their territory, but I am not particularly afraid of wolves because I understand their behavior. Cultural note: timber wolves in northern Ontario are apex pack predators that rely on coordinated surrounding tactics to evaluate threats or unfamiliar targets. Wildlife behavior studies show that wolves rarely attack humans unprovoked, and maintaining high ground while demonstrating steady dominance, such as standing still on elevated structures, is often enough to disrupt their hunting calculus and trigger a flight response. I have to admit this memory is a bit fuzzy since I was drinking at the time. It happened quite a while ago. I was mostly just hiking through the dense brush, listening to a podcast on my headphones. I brought my rifle along, hoping to bag a wild hog, though I wasn't really expecting to find much. At one point, I started randomly scoping the woods through my optics, hoping to spot some movement. I ended up locking my lens onto a middle-aged man standing deep in the thicket. I immediately panicked. The alcohol in my system made me terrified that I was going to accidentally aim too close or trigger a bad situation. But it didn't fully hit me until a few seconds later. The guy was standing perfectly still, holding a shotgun in a highly alarming position. He was resting the barrel directly under his own chin. I found him again with my scope, making absolutely sure not to even touch my own trigger. I just watched him through the glass for a few minutes. The guy had to be in his mid-30s. He had this completely dead-eyed, empty look fixed on his face. As I watched, I saw his trigger finger jerk and twitch a few times. He was tensing up without actually firing the weapon. He looked entirely hollow inside. He barely moved a muscle. The only part of him that had any motion was his hands and his arms, which kept twitching and jerking under the weight of the firearm. I thought about yelling out to him, but I tried to practice speaking to myself first, and I realized I couldn't talk without slurring my words badly. Because of that, I decided to just keep quiet in the brush. Eventually, the confusion and the alcohol caught up with me. I ended up putting my head down on a large log just to think for a few moments about what to do, but I ended up passing out right there. I woke up hours later with ants crawling all over my clothes. After frantically brushing them off, the memory of that strange guy came rushing back. I checked through my scope but couldn't locate him anywhere. I decided to stand up and walk over to the exact spot where he had been standing. But before I even made it across the clearing, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. There were fresh footprints pressed into the dirt right near my log, and they definitely were not mine. I know this for a fact, because I checked the tread pattern on the bottom of my own boots, and they didn't match at all. I am certain that guy walked over and checked me out while I was unconscious. I was wearing bright red clothing so I wouldn't get targeted by other hunters, so I stood out like a sore thumb. I finally walked over to the exact spot where he had been standing with the weapon. There was no one there. He had left behind nothing but a can of soda, an empty envelope, and a single metal nail driven into a tree trunk. That whole situation completely freaked me out. Cultural note: high visibility clothing such as blaze orange or bright red is designed to ensure hunter recognition in dense timber. However, as outdoor safety reports note, wearing highly visible gear while incapacitated or impaired in isolated game lands can inadvertently draw the attention of unidentified individuals or trespassers operating in the same perimeter, severely compromising a person's situational security. A buddy and I went hunting over a long weekend a few years back. We hiked deep into our designated hunting terrain and set up camp. This was in the middle of nowhere, deep within the vast Norwegian wilderness. We actually had exclusive hunting rights to the entire area. Because of that, We didn't expect to see another soul out there. There was absolutely no cell service within a 6-kilometer radius. Getting back to our cars meant a grueling 10-kilometer trek. Our tent was pitched right next to a small, isolated lake. For the first couple of days, we had the entire landscape to ourselves. Not a single trace of human activity. On our final night, we were sitting by the campfire eating dinner. It was getting pretty late. Everything outside the immediate glow of our fire was pitch black. The shadows felt incredibly heavy. Suddenly, a loud crack shattered the silence. Someone took a shot on the other side of the lake. It sounded exactly like a high-powered rifle. We thought it was strange since no other hunters were permitted nearby, but we shrugged it off. We figured it was just someone messing around much further away than it actually sounded. We went right back to our meal. About 10 minutes later, a second shot rang out. This time, the blast was much louder. It was dangerously close. Before we could even process the sound, a bullet slammed into the rocks right next to us. It was maybe 5 meters away. Shrapnel and dirt sprayed into the air. We both froze. We just stared at each other in sheer disbelief. The realization hit us like a physical blow. Someone was actively targeting our campfire. We bolted toward the tent and grabbed our shotguns. We didn't even think about packing. We just ran blindly into the dense woods, looking for any cover we could find. We hunkered down in the brush, trying to control our breathing. A few minutes passed, then another shot echoed through the night. We heard the impact clear as day. We were absolutely certain it hit our tent. We were completely trapped. We had zero cell service to call for help. Running through the pitch-black wilderness without flashlights was a death sentence, but turning on a light would turn us into perfect targets. We managed to find a large, downed tree with a small cave-like hollow beneath the massive roots. We squeezed inside. We just sat there in the freezing dark, clutching our weapons, waiting for the morning light. As soon as dawn broke, we sprinted back to the campsite. We packed our gear in a frantic panic, and basically ran the entire 10 kilometers back to our cars. We called the authorities immediately. They took the report very seriously, but the investigation yielded nothing. We still have no idea who was behind that rifle. Poaching is almost unheard of in Norway. There was no logical reason for anyone to be out there with a weapon. I have never felt that kind of terror in my entire life. Cultural note: Norway enforces strict hunting regulations and territory zoning, meaning unauthorized firearms in exclusive zones are treated as severe criminal offenses. Due to the country's exceptionally low violent crime rates, unprovoked firearm encounters in remote wilderness areas like the boreal forests are exceedingly rare, making such incidents highly anomalies for local law enforcement. My mate and I were out pig hunting deep in the bush around Jennellen. That is over in New South Wales, Australia. We were tracking 2 massive wild pigs that were happily tearing up a muddy riverbank. We had the perfect setup. We were completely downwind and staying dead still in the thick brush. We were maybe 30 meters away from them. Our rifles were raised, and we were just about to take our shots. Suddenly, out of nowhere, both pigs absolutely bolted. They took off at full speed like they had seen a ghost. We literally just stood up and shook our heads in confusion. We had no clue it could have spooked them like that. I have never seen a wild pig go from 0 to full flight without a gunshot dropping first. Since the hunt was busted and we were pretty exhausted, we decided to pack it in for the night. We started hiking back through a really dense pine forest. We were maybe 100 meters away from the spot where we lost the pigs. That is when it happened. We both heard this deep, rumbling growl. I swear to God, it sounded exactly like a lion from an African wildlife documentary. There is absolutely nothing in the Australian bush that makes a sound like that. Nothing at all. I have never felt a sudden wave of fear like that in my entire life. Then another realization hit me. There was no birdsong anywhere around us. We were right at the time when the evening chorus should have been deafening, but the woods were dead silent. We stood there frozen for about 5 minutes in the fading light. Our rifles were raised and ready, staring into the quiet trees. Still no birds. We finally decided to make a break for the fire trail where I parked my truck. It was a tense 30-minute walk in the gathering dusk. We kept our weapons up the whole time, jumping out of our skin every single time a distant bird shrieked. I still do not know what made that sound, but I will never forget how primally terrifying it was. It felt like evolution had programmed our DNA to completely freeze up upon hearing it. I have not hunted that area a single time since then, and that originally happened back in 2006. Cultural note. The Jenolan area in New South Wales is famous for its dense limestone caves and rugged bushland, which has fueled local urban legends for decades. Among hunters and locals, there are persistent rumors of the Lithgow panther, or phantom big cats, supposed descendants of escaped exotic predators or military mascots, which are often blamed for unexplained livestock mutilations and deep non-native predatory growls in the region. Like what you see? Subscribe to the Reddit Oracle for more. I was a young hunter, and it was only my second time out in the woods. I was sitting up in a tree stand with my uncle, completely thrilled to be there. To paint a picture, our stand was positioned near the bottom corner of an acre of land. We had 2 full acres visible from our spot. One stretched out right in front of us, and the other opened up to our right. We had been waiting for 2 or 3 hours, hoping some deer would show up. The woods were incredibly active. We kept hearing turkeys, foxes, all kinds of birds, and of course, squirrels rustling in the leaves. Eventually, at the opposite end of the clearing, a small deer stepped out from the tree line. I immediately raised my weapon and got ready just in case. My uncle caught my eye and signaled for me to let it go. He later explained that it would have been an extremely difficult shot, even for an experienced hunter. Plus, the deer was fairly small, maybe a year old. So I just sat back and watched this beautiful animal munch away at the grass, wagging its little white tail. My uncle and I shared a quick smile. I was amazed that our camouflage and tree stand actually worked. Then bam! Out of nowhere, a massive bear lunged straight out of the thick brush. It absolutely annihilated that young deer in a split second. The animal did not even have time to react. The force of the strike took care of everything instantly. The bear dragged the heavy weight back into the thick brush. All that raw motion and terrifying power took less than 3 seconds. I was in absolute awe. Even replaying it now in my head, I still just think to myself, what the hell just happened? I was shocked, terrified, and excited all at the same time. My uncle, though, had a look of classic pale fear on his face. He was probably terrified because I was so young and he was responsible for my safety out there. It was jarring to see him that worried. Bears are extremely rare in our specific area. The fact that this huge predator was patrolling around, hiding unseen and unheard by either of us, was completely mind-boggling. About 30 minutes later, my uncle decided it was time for us to pack up and leave. We climbed down, walked back to the truck, and threw our gear into the bed. He started up the engine, but I was still walking around the back, taking my sweet time. I stretched out, letting the sun hit my face and the cool air fill my lungs. I do not remember exactly why, but my eyes suddenly fixated on one specific area of the woods. It was as if my brain knew it was seeing something out of place, but it was not fully processing the shape yet. Suddenly, the whole mood in the air shifted. The cool breeze felt entirely dull and heavy. I sensed something was horribly wrong. I slowly started to turn around to walk toward the passenger door, but I kept my eyes locked on that specific part of the tree line. Just before I pulled the handle to get inside, that same massive bear poked its head out from behind the brush. It was still pretty far away, but I could clearly see its face and jaws were heavily stained from its recent meal. It just stood there, staring directly at me. The silence was deafening. I quickly closed the car door and kept watching it through the back window of the cab. My uncle noticed my expression and looked over as well. This time, there was no excitement. We were both just flat out terrified. I have never seen or heard anything like that since that day, but it was a harsh lesson. You need to be alert and on your toes 100% of the time when you are out there. That predator moved like a ghost, despite weighing hundreds of pounds. Cultural note: tree stands are elevated platforms used by hunters to gain a wider field of view and keep their scent above the ground, making them nearly invisible to game animals. However, as experienced hunters know, these stands can create a false sense of security. While they protect against ground-level detection from target prey like deer, they do not mask a hunter's presence from apex predators with highly acute senses of smell and hearing, such as bears, who routinely monitor game trails for easy meals. This goes a bit off tangent, but back in the 80s, my grandpa worked as a game warden. One quiet evening, he decided to pass through a remote area down an old dirt road. It was a spot that usually got pretty popular for camping and fishing during the summer. The peak camping season had not started yet. Because of that, he really did not expect anyone to be down there. The entire area was supposed to be completely empty. After walking around the grounds for a bit, a high-pitched cry shattered the silence. For a brief second, his instincts kicked in. He genuinely thought it was the sound of a mountain lion. If you have never heard one, wild mountain lions can sound an awful lot like a person screaming at the top of their lungs. In that split second, he was honestly about to turn around and get out of there. But then, the sound changed. He started hearing heavy sobbing as well. He immediately ran toward the direction of the noise. He broke through the brush and came across a horrific scene. Several men had cornered a woman in the dark and were violently overpowering her. The men immediately booked it and scattered into the woods the second they saw his uniform. He chose not to pursue them into the dark right then. Instead, he called for an immediate tactical search of the area, while he stayed behind to make sure the woman was safe. Thanks to his quick coordination, all those men were eventually caught by the authorities. The lady managed to make it out of that awful ordeal without any permanent physical damage. Out of his many years spent outdoors for work and recreation, this is the one single event he always told me was the scariest thing he had ever witnessed out there. Cultural note: during the decade of the 80s, game wardens and park rangers in remote areas often operated with limited real-time communication infrastructure, relying heavily on high-frequency radio channels. Because peak season camping grounds lacked active staff during off months, these isolated locations occasionally became blind spots for local law enforcement, making routine off-season patrols critical for public safety. This might not sound as terrifying as other stories out there, but it completely freaked me out. I was actually out fishing for bass rather than hunting. I was working a spot not very far from a massive downed tree that had settled deep into the water. Suddenly, I heard a lot of intense splashing and thrashing sounds coming directly from that area. I decided to paddle closer to investigate. As I approached, I spotted the top of a massive catfish's head breaking the surface. I could see everything from the gills up. It looked like another fisherman had lost a lure in the branches of that submerged tree. The catfish had bitten down on it and gotten severely hooked. I assumed it was just stuck out there, wiggling around frantically to free itself from the line. I felt bad for the creature, so I went back home to grab my kayak. I paddled all the way out to the log, determined to cut the hook loose and save it. The fish was still moving, though its movements were much weaker than before. I could see the heavy hook lodged in its jaw. I figured it would be perfectly fine once I managed to set it free. However, the exact moment I pulled my kayak right next to the catfish, a wave of pure horror hit me. From the gills down, there was absolutely no flesh left. It was nothing but a bare white skeleton picked entirely clean. The poor creature had likely been gone for quite a while. That frantic wiggling motion was not the fish fighting for life at all. It was actually a group of turtles and other aggressive underwater scavengers hiding beneath the shadow of the log. They were actively ripping the remaining flesh from the bones from below. The sight sent such a massive jolt of adrenaline through my body that I lost my balance. I nearly fell right out of my kayak into that murky water. I turned right around and paddled back as fast as I could. My family and I often head deep into the woods several hours before the first break of day. We do this so we can get into position and settle down before the wildlife starts moving around. It was archery season, and we were targeting deer. We were climbing a steep mountain to get up to our usual stand. It was a route we had taken many times in years past. I was carrying a heavy crossbow. I was simply too young and too small when this happened to be able to pull back a standard bow. My weapon only had a single bolt loaded. There was no backup because I would never be able to cock that heavy crossbow for a second shot anyway. We had been silently trudging through the still woods for about half an hour. My adrenaline was already pumping hard from the brutal upward climb. To make matters worse, I had recently finished reading a horror book called The Oath. The plot was about a massive black shadowy entity on a remote mountain that kept taking the local townspeople. I had a small green light mounted to the bill of my hat so I could see the trail, but the beam was getting incredibly dim from hours of continuous use. I stopped for a moment to catch my breath. Suddenly, a heavy sensation hit me. I felt like something was actively watching me from the shadows. I tried to shrug it off. To be honest, you feel that way a lot when you are out in the woods at 4 a.m. in pitch darkness. But I decided to look up and get my bearings anyway. My eyes strained against the dim green glow. Right ahead of me, I spotted a large, hunched, black-as-night monstrous form blocking the path. In that exact split second, my hat light completely cut out. I was frozen solid. The absolute darkness swallowed the trail. As my eyes slowly adjusted to the sudden blackout, I could see the massive black form casting a heavy silhouette on the forest floor under the dim moonlight. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it ringing in my ears. That was when I noticed the two cold eyes staring directly back at me through the brush. I honestly do not remember how that terrifying standoff ended. The panic must have blurred my memory. The next thing I can actually recall, my feet felt like lead weights as I was trudging back up the mountain, desperately fiddling with the switch of my broken light. Cultural note: navigating wilderness terrain at 4 a.m. requires specialized low-intensity lighting, such as green or red LED headlamps, which preserve a hunter's night vision and avoid spooking game. However, operating in apex predator territory during pre-dawn hours with failing equipment significantly compromises situational awareness, as large mammals like black bears are highly active during these nocturnal transitions and will stand their ground when startled on a narrow mountain trail. My dad used to fish using a traditional method that involved setting up multiple rods made of bamboo. He would place them about 5 yards apart from one another along the water. The baits were usually small, live frogs. It was a very specific setup designed to catch a predatory catfish-like species that only fed after dark. Because of how the rods were spaced out, he constantly had to walk back and forth along the muddy riverbank just to check on them. I decided to tag along on one of these night trips. It resulted in a memory that will remain burned into my brain for as long as I live. I was just sitting on the riverbank, right next to our parked motorcycle. I was minding my own business, happily munching on some snacks I had brought from home. My dad was about 70 yards away from my position, doing his usual rounds in the dark. Suddenly, I heard the heavy sound of footsteps. I looked up and saw my dad sprinting toward me at full speed. I swear I had never seen such pure, unadulterated terror on someone's face, especially not on his. He didn't explain anything. He just frantically told me to hop on the motorcycle right that second, screaming that we were going home immediately. I was completely confused and asked, "What about the fishing rods?" But he ignored me, kicked the engine to life, and sped away into the night. To be honest, I didn't think much of it back then. I was just a kid who hated waiting around, and night fishing wasn't really my thing. I was just glad to be heading back early. My dad ended up driving back to collect his gear the following morning. It wasn't until about 6 or 7 years later, when I was in high school, that the truth came out. My dad asked me to join him on another trip, and that gave me the courage to finally ask him what had actually happened on that bizarre night. He told me that from where he was standing, the river made a sharp curve to the right. He had heard a faint splashing sound in the water, indicating that a fish was hooked on one of the bamboo poles. But as he approached the bank, he froze. A woman with incredibly long hair, wearing a loose white robe, was squatting right next to his fishing rod. Her back was turned toward him. Thinking it was just a local villager trying to steal his catch, he stepped forward and firmly asked her what she thought she was doing. The figure slowly stood up. She began rotating her body to the left to face him. But there was absolutely nothing where her face was supposed to be. It wasn't a flat, pale surface like a generic ghost story. It was an active, shifting void. It was completely blank and as black as the night itself, like looking into an empty abyss. My dad froze solid. That is when the entity spoke a single word in a low tone, "Muliho." In our local tongue, that means, "Go home." That was the exact moment his survival instincts kicked in, and he fled. My dad was a school teacher. He was a funny man who always had a joke up his sleeve, even winning awards at his school for his humor. I knew his personality perfectly, and I could easily tell when he was messing with me and when he was being completely serious. He told me he panicked not just to save himself, but because he deeply feared that seeing such an entity was a terrible omen for our family. Fortunately, nothing ever happened to us. All we lost that night was a couple of fish. Cultural note: the entity described closely matches the kuntilanak, or Pontianak, from Southeast Asian folklore, specifically Indonesian and Malaysian river traditions, often depicted as long-haired women in white robes near water sources. Encounters with these figures are deeply feared in rural areas, where local dialects use specific commands like muliho to warn intruders away from supernatural territories. I do a lot of solo backpacking hunts deep in the remote backcountry. When you spend that much time completely isolated in the wilderness, you are bound to experience more than a few creepy moments. A few specific encounters still stand out vividly in my mind. The first one happened while I was sleeping in a hammock. I was deep within a designated wilderness area of the eastern Sierra Mountains. It was during the archery season, which meant I did not have a rifle on me. I only had my bow. In the dead of night, I was suddenly jolted awake by a demonic scream. It sounded completely unnatural. A few moments later, the exact same noise ripped through the trees, only it was much louder and significantly closer to my position. The screams continued to echo every 30 seconds or so for about 20 minutes. Every single time the sound dropped, it seemed to come from a completely different direction and distance. It felt as if whatever was making that noise was actively circling my hammock, closing the gap. I decided my best bet was to stay perfectly still inside my shelter. Eventually, the terrifying noise just stopped for the rest of the night. I found out later it was actually a female mountain lion. If you have never heard that specific sound, it is a bone-chilling shriek that sounds like human agony. It would have been terrifying, even if I had known what it was at the time. The second incident took place on a rocky peak at about 11,500 feet in elevation. I was sitting about 500 yards above the tree line. It was midday with clear blue skies, and I was entirely focused on glassing the valley below me for game. I happened to turn around, and the sky directly behind me had turned completely black. A massive, violent alpine thunderstorm had materialized out of nowhere. Lightning started striking the peaks, and the flash and the thunder were practically simultaneous. It immediately started pouring rain. I scrambled to strap my bow, which was loaded with carbon arrows, and my aluminum tripod to my backpack. I started hauling ass down the wet, slippery scree, desperate to reach the relative safety of the tree line. I would sprint to a group of small bushes, crouch down to catch my breath, and then run another 100 yards, avoiding any tall, isolated trees. I witnessed at least a dozen direct lightning strikes hitting the high points within 1.5 miles of me during that panic-filled scramble. Honestly, I was expecting to get struck right there and never be found. Lightning remains one of my absolute biggest fears when I'm up in the mountains. A nearly identical situation happened 2 years later in the same range, only instead of rain, a whiteout blizzard blindsided me, forcing me to hike 2 miles out of my way just to stay under tree cover because of the constant electrical discharges. Other smaller things out there stay with you too, like the time I found a small child's shoe miles away from any established trail or campground, or the time I stumbled upon a crude hermit-like shelter built in the brush. It had a bizarre shrine made of various full-size shampoo bottles lined up outside. I did not stick around to see if anyone was hiding inside. I have also come across a couple of abandoned, illegal wilderness marijuana grows. They always leave behind tons of trash, hazardous materials, and complex irrigation lines. Stumbling onto those sites always puts me heavily on edge. You never know if the people protecting the perimeter are still lurking nearby, or if they left behind dangerous booby traps for intruders. Cultural note: illegal cultivation sites in remote U.S. national forests, often operated by organized cartels, present severe hazards for backcountry hunters. These covert operations routinely utilize banned chemical hazards to protect crops and establish armed perimeters, making the discovery of irrigation lines or remote campsites a high-priority safety concern for federal land wardens. I have a couple of stories from my time out in the bush. The first one happened when I was hunting for moose just north of my grandfather's ranch. I had never really explored this specific sector before. From the moment I started, the trails I was navigating on my quad gave me nothing but terrible luck. I was constantly getting whipped in the face by low saplings and almost got stuck in the mud a couple of times. But the creepiest part was the timber. Trees that were easily 20 to 30 feet high were bent and snapped in half directly in front of the trails, almost completely blocking the path. There were dozens of them. Some of the breaks were located about 10 to 12 feet up the trunks. You could technically explain that by heavy winter snow, but the sheer number of shattered trees in that one area was just a bit too much. I trudged through the debris anyway, but I suddenly got this eerie, heavy feeling in my chest. Something inside me was screaming to stop what I was doing and head straight back home. I was determined to reach a hidden lake I had spotted on a map so I could set up and start making some moose calls. As I got closer to the water, the trail turned into a series of dry mud pits. My quad managed to glide over most of them, except for one. The tires suddenly sank deep into the mire. The mud felt thick and heavy, almost like Play-Doh. I sweated my balls off for an hour trying to push the heavy machine out of the rut, but the sun was rapidly dipping below the tree line. It was getting dark fast. I finally said the hell with it, abandoned the vehicle, and started walking the trail on foot. As I was moving through the shadows, the entire forest seemed to come alive. You could hear massive animals breaking through the branches in absolutely every direction. It was peak rutting season, meaning the bulls are hyper-aggressive and do not care if you are a mouse or a grizzly bear. To make matters worse, the shadows turned pitch black. Something heavy was actively circling my perimeter, stepping hard on dry branches and letting me know it was right there in the dark. I finally caught a single bar of cell service and frantically texted my uncle to come locate me with his side-by-side vehicle. He managed to track me down, and I finally made it out of that absolute nightmare zone. A couple of days later, I went over to my grandfather's place. He looked at me and told me to take my quad north up the trail about 300 meters and report back on what I saw. I rode out there, and right at the opening of the trail, 2 birch saplings about 8 feet high on opposite sides of the path had been deliberately bent over and woven together, forming a perfect arch over the dirt road. Even crazier, one of the trees on the left side had been pulled straight out of the ground vertically. Judging by the massive amount of dirt and deep roots that had come up with it, whatever did that had to possess unreal physical strength. It couldn't have been a bull moose using its antlers because there wasn't enough clearance for the rack to catch. It couldn't have been a bear either. We took it as a clear warning, but we had no idea what was issuing it. I have another story that my buddy shared with us at work about his childhood. I have absolutely no reason to doubt his word because the guy has nothing to prove to us. He said that when he was a kid, he was sitting in the middle of a single cab truck between his mother and father. His dad was out hunting for deer, and they eventually pulled up next to a massive open field. Right in the center of this clearing, there was a patch of thick brush spanning about 25 feet in diameter. Standing around that brush in a perfect uniform formation were several massive white-tailed bucks. They kept a strict distance of about 5 feet between each other, and every single one of them was facing inward, staring directly toward the center of the thicket. The dad thought this behavior was obviously bizarre. He stepped out and fired a single warning shot straight up into the air to spook them. Instead of scattering, all the bucks turned their heads in unison and stared directly at the truck. Then right in the middle of the brush, a massive towering silhouette stood up on 2 legs. The creature looked straight at their vehicle, turned around, and calmly walked across the open field into the deep woods. The moment it moved, the spell broke, and the deer scattered in a frantic panic. I have been out in the bush a lot throughout my life, and I can tell you for a fact that there are truly unexplainable things lurking out there. Cultural note: deep forest anomalies such as woven tree arches and vertically uprooted saplings are frequently documented by backcountry game wardens in North America. While official forestry reports attribute these structures to rare weather microbursts or heavy snow loads bending pliable birchwood, local hunting communities often view them as territorial markers left by unclassified wildlife or transient individuals operating off the grid. If you like these stories, make sure to subscribe to the Reddit Oracle.